Chapter 1. The morning I'll never forget. I still remember the sound of it. The thud when she shoved my wife to the floor, the sharp cry that followed, and the silence that came after. It wasn't just a fall. It was the sound of something breaking inside our family. For 8 years, we had given everything to keep peace under this roof, our patience, our comfort, our pride. But kindness has a limit. That morning, as my daughter-in-law stood there holding my newborn grandson like a prize she had claimed, I realized she hadn't just crossed a line. She had erased it. My name is Robert Callahan, and this is the story of how love, silence, and trust turned into a battle for my own home. That morning started like any other in our quiet home in Austin. The sunlight came through the kitchen window, soft and warm, touching the worn oak table where Maggie had already placed a pot of coffee. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. For a moment, it felt peaceful. But peace has a strange way of collapsing in an instant. I was sitting by the counter reading the paper when I heard a sharp sound from the living room. Not a cry, not a laugh. It was Maggie's startled gasp. I looked up and saw her stumble backward, clutching her arm. Standing over her was Ava, holding baby Oliver tight against her chest. Ava's voice cut through the house. "Don't touch him. You're filthy." The words hung in the air like poison. Maggie froze, her eyes wide, hurt flashing across her face. She had only reached out, just wanted to hold our first grandchild, the one she had spent weeks preparing for. There were baby clothes folded in perfect stacks, bottles cleaned and lined up on the counter, a small bassinet she'd built herself. And now, after all that love, she was being called dirty. I stood there for a second that felt like a lifetime. The coffee steamed beside me. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft whimper of the newborn. Then I moved. Maggie tried to pick herself up, her hands trembling. I went to her, put a hand on her shoulder, and helped her to her feet. She was shaking, but she didn't cry. Her face was pale, her lips tight. She looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen in 40 years of marriage. Humiliation. Ava stood her ground. Her hair was perfectly styled, even though she'd just come home from the hospital. She looked down at Maggie as if she were a stranger who had stepped somewhere she didn't belong. "He needs to rest," Ava said coldly. "You'll just make him sick." My voice came out lower than I expected. Maggie was only trying to help. Ava shifted the baby to her other arm. "We don't need help. What we need is quiet." I could feel my pulse in my neck. For a second, I thought I might lose it, but I caught myself. I looked at Maggie again. Her hands were red where she'd hit the hardwood. She reached for a towel on the chair, quietly wiped her palms, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "It's all right. I was only going to kiss his forehead." Ava didn't respond. She turned and walked toward the nursery, closing the door behind her. The sound of it latching was soft but final. Maggie sat down on the couch, her shoulders trembling. She kept her eyes on the floor, refusing to let tears fall. I stood there, helpless, trying to find the right words and failing. For years we had opened this home to our son and his wife, given them space, comfort, and support. Now my wife was being treated like an intruder in the house she had made a home. I walked to the window. Outside, the yard was bright, the oak tree Maggie planted when Ethan was a boy, swaying gently in the breeze. Everything looked normal, but the air inside felt heavy, suffocating. I sat down beside her. "Maggie, are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No, just..." Surprised. Her voice broke on that last word. I took her hand. "You don't deserve this." She gave a small, tired smile. "She's just stressed, Rob. The baby, the lack of sleep." She doesn't mean it. But she did. I saw it in Ava's eyes. That wasn't exhaustion or confusion. It was control. The clock ticked on the wall, steady and cold. My heart beat slower now, but each thud felt heavier. Maggie got up quietly and went to the kitchen. She started to clean, wiping the counters that were already spotless. It was her way of coping. I stayed there, staring at the door to the nursery. I could hear faint movements, the baby's tiny cry, Ava's voice soothing him. It should have been a sound that filled the house with joy. Instead, it sounded like a warning. After a while, Ethan came down the stairs. His hair was messy, his eyes tired. "What happened?" he asked. "Ask your wife," I said. He frowned. "Dad, please, not now. She just gave birth." Maggie turned from the sink. "Ethan," she pushed me. He blinked, unsure. "I'm sure she didn't mean to. She's emotional." I looked at my son and felt something cold settle in my chest. He was defending her without even asking what she had done. "Ethan, you need to talk to her." "Dad, don't make things worse." Worse? I wanted to laugh. My wife had just been shoved to the ground in her own home, called filthy, and he thought I was the one making it worse. I didn't argue. I couldn't. I just looked at him until he turned away. Uncomfortable under my silence, he went back upstairs without another word. When the house was quiet again, Maggie came to me and placed her hand on my arm. "Let it go," she whispered. For now, I nodded. But inside, something had changed. Something I couldn't ignore anymore. I looked around the living room, the family photos on the mantel, the quilt Maggie had made when Ethan was a child. This was our home, filled with decades of laughter, holidays, arguments, forgiveness. It had always been a place of safety. But standing there, in that quiet after the storm, I realized it didn't feel safe anymore. I waited until I heard the baby settle, until Ava's footsteps stopped upstairs. Then I picked up my phone and called Ethan's number again. He answered, half whispering, "Dad, please, can we talk later?" "No. We talk now." There was silence on the other end. Then he said, "What do you want to say?" I closed my eyes, took a breath that hurt on the way out, and said the only thing that mattered. "This stops now." I hung up before he could respond. The sound of the click felt final, like a door closing on the life we had known. Maggie was watching me from across the room. "What did you tell him?" she asked softly. "The truth," I said. "That it's over." She didn't reply. She just nodded, the corners of her eyes shining, not from tears, but from understanding. We sat there together as the light faded, the sound of the baby's quiet breathing drifting through the closed door. Outside, the Texas sun began to set, throwing long shadows across the yard. I stared at the walls I had painted myself, the floor I'd nailed down with my own hands, and for the first time in 40 years, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Chapter 2. 8 years of kindness taken for granted. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time when our house was filled with laughter, when the sound of Ethan's voice coming through the front door meant home, not tension. I can still remember the day he called from San Antonio to tell us he was getting married. Maggie had cried happy tears. She said Ava sounded polite and well-spoken on the phone, a good match for our boy. I wanted to believe that. I really did. They married in the spring of 2015. Maggie wore her best dress to the small church ceremony, and I stood beside Ethan as his best man because he didn't have anyone else close enough. Ava looked radiant that day, all smiles and confidence, promising to take care of our son. For a while, she did. After the wedding, they rented a small apartment in Round Rock. Ethan was working for a construction management company then, and Ava was between jobs. 6 months later, they came over for dinner and told us they were behind on rent. Maggie reached across the table and said, "Just come stay with us for a little while. It'll give you time to save up." I hesitated, but seeing Ethan's shoulders relax when I nodded made me think it was the right thing to do. "Just a year or two," I said. "No more." They moved in that fall. At first, it was fine. Ava thanked us every morning. offered to cook, and even helped Maggie in the garden. We had dinners together, talked about Ethan's projects, watched baseball in the living room. It felt like family. Maggie was happy to have them home, and I told myself this was what good parents did, that helping your children when they needed you wasn't a mistake. But kindness, I've learned, has an expiration date when it's not appreciated. By the second year, things started to change. Ava began rearranging the furniture. At first, it was little things, a lamp here, a picture frame there. Then one day I came home and found that the old family portrait from the hallway had been replaced with a large abstract painting. When I asked where it was, she said, it didn't fit the new aesthetic. The new aesthetic. I remember Maggie's face when she heard that. She went quiet, just nodded, as if losing a piece of our history didn't matter. Later that night, she whispered to me that she'd put the picture in the attic, safe from being thrown out. Ava started cooking more often too, which Maggie didn't mind until the comments began. Too much salt, she'd say. Or, you really shouldn't fry food at your age. Maggie tried to laugh it off, but I could see it bothered her. By the third year, Ava had taken over the kitchen entirely. She bought new cookware and boxed up the old set Maggie had owned for 40 years. I found it all stacked neatly in the garage, labeled Donate. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs to find Ava standing in the living room with a tape measure, marking the wall. She said she wanted to open up the space. I asked her to leave it alone. She smiled that tight smile of hers and said, it's just a suggestion. I told Ethan later that evening, son, your wife is making this house hers. He sighed, rubbed his face, and said, Dad, please, let her be. She's trying to make things better. Better for who? I wanted to ask, but I didn't. By the fourth year, Maggie barely cooked. She said Ava preferred healthier meals, which meant we ate quinoa and grilled vegetables instead of pot roast and mashed potatoes. Ava claimed it was good for us. I stopped arguing because every time I did, Ethan looked at me like I was the one causing trouble. The breaking point came in the fifth year. Ava came into the living room holding a clipboard. She said she and Ethan had been talking, and they thought it would be safer if Maggie and I moved to the upstairs bedroom. She mentioned the stairs, said they were worried we might fall one day. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were already on the master bedroom behind her, as if it belonged to her. Maggie looked at me, uncertain. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't ready to give up the room where we'd spent decades of mornings and nights together, but I saw the hope on Ethan's face, the way he wanted peace, and I said, if it makes you both comfortable, sure. That night, Maggie sat on the edge of the smaller bed upstairs. It creaked under her weight. She said softly, we should be proud. They're starting their own family here. I didn't answer. I stared out the window at the oak tree swaying in the dark. It didn't feel like pride. It felt like defeat. The following months, Ava redecorated the master bedroom, changed the curtains, the bedding, even the wall color. When I passed by, she said, don't worry, we'll take care of it like it's ours. That was the first time I heard her use the word ours. The sixth year came with more changes. She took control of the mail, claiming she wanted to organize the bills. She signed up for new services, added online accounts, and started managing the grocery budget. I still paid for everything, but it was her system. Maggie started to fade. She stayed upstairs more, reading or gardening when the weather allowed. She'd say she was tired, but I knew it was more than that. Every small comment from Ava chipped away at her confidence. Sometimes, she'd stand at the bottom of the stairs, listening to laughter from the living room, and then quietly turn away. I tried talking to Ethan. I said, son, your mother feels like a guest in her own house. He sighed and said, Dad, we're all family here. Why make it sound like a competition? Because it was, though none of us wanted to admit it. By the seventh year, I had stopped noticing the little things she changed because there were too many to count. The walls were repainted, the dishes replaced, the family photos moved into storage. The house didn't look like ours anymore. Then came the 8th year, the one that would finally expose everything. Ava had just had Oliver. Her tone shifted completely once she became a mother. She treated Maggie as if she were a stranger. Every conversation was colder, every request sharper. The night before the incident, I heard them talking downstairs. Maggie asked if she could help with the baby once they got home from the hospital. Ava said, "I don't think that's a good idea. We'll handle it ourselves." Maggie told me later that she wasn't angry, just sad. She'd been waiting her whole life to be a grandmother, to hold that baby, and now she was being pushed away. The next morning, after the shouting, after the fall, after everything changed, I realized that kindness without boundaries wasn't love. It was surrender. For 8 years, we had tried to be the good parents, the ones who didn't interfere, who kept the peace no matter what. But peace built on silence is fragile. As I stood in the quiet of our upstairs room that evening, the air heavy with the smell of paint and new curtains, I thought about all the choices we'd made to avoid conflict. Each one had taken a piece of us. When you spend too long keeping the peace, you forget where you surrendered. Chapter 3. Something didn't feel right. A few weeks after Oliver was born, the house started to feel different. It wasn't the kind of change you could see right away. It was in the air, a quiet tension that grew stronger every day. Maggie moved softer, spoke quieter, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. Ava had taken full control of the baby's schedule, the feeding, the visitors, even the temperature in the house. She said she didn't want germs, or noise, or stress. What she really didn't want was interference. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and found Maggie holding a small blanket, folding it carefully. Ava appeared out of nowhere, her tone sharp. "Please don't touch his things." Maggie froze, her hand still mid-fold. She tried to explain that she was just tidying up, but Ava took the blanket from her and said, "It's not about cleaning, it's about routine. The baby needs consistency." Then she walked away, leaving the silence behind her. Maggie looked at me with that familiar, tired smile she used when she wanted to hide her pain. "It's fine," she whispered. "She's nervous." I nodded, but the pit in my stomach told me it wasn't nerves. It was control. As days passed, Ava's reach expanded beyond the nursery. She began organizing the mail, setting up online bill payments, and keeping the house records on her laptop. I noticed my name less and less on the envelopes. Instead, it was Ava Hartwell Callahan, printed neatly where mine should have been. At first, I thought it was a clerical mistake. But then it kept happening. The electric bill, the gas, even the property tax notice from the county office had her name listed as resident contact. I asked Ethan about it one evening when we were both in the garage fixing the mower. "Son, why are all the bills coming under Ava's name?" He wiped his hands on a rag and shrugged. "She's better at managing things online. You know how you hate those websites. It's just easier." I watched him avoid eye contact, focused on the spark plug, like it was the most important thing in the world. I let it go for the moment, but something inside me twisted. I'd built this house with my own 2 hands, every nail, every brick. Now it felt like I was slowly disappearing from it, one piece of paper at a time. Maggie tried to keep things light. She'd talk about her garden, about the wildflowers coming up by the fence, but she was retreating too. She stopped going into the nursery altogether. She said she didn't want to upset Ava. At dinner, Ava talked about Oliver's milestones as if we weren't sitting there. "He smiled today," she'd say proudly, then turn to Maggie and add, "But you don't need to worry about feeding him. We've got it under control." Ethan would nod along. He looked exhausted, his eyes dark from sleepless nights. Sometimes I wondered if he noticed how his wife had taken over everything, but maybe he didn't want to see it. One Saturday morning, I went out to check the mail. The stack was thicker than usual. I flipped through it and stopped when I saw another bill, with Ava's name printed boldly across the top. She had even changed the contact address to her email. My own phone number was missing. I walked back inside, the paper still in my hand. Maggie was making tea. She saw the look on my face and asked, "What's wrong?" I held the envelope out. "Look at this." She read it, frowning slightly. "Maybe it's nothing," she said quietly. "Maybe she's just helping. Helping doesn't mean erasing us." She put the envelope down and sighed. "Let's just keep the peace, Robert. The baby's still small. Keep the peace." Those words again. I'd spent years doing exactly that. But this time, the peace felt more like surrender. That night, I couldn't sleep. The baby monitor hummed softly from their room down the hall. Every now and then, I'd hear Oliver's cry, followed by Ava's low voice soothing him, and Ethan's footsteps moving in the background. The rhythm of it had become a kind of soundtrack to the house. I got up, went downstairs, and poured a glass of water. The lights from the street fell through the blinds, striping the floor. That's when I heard her voice. It came from the kitchen. I froze. Ava was on the phone, her tone calm but deliberate. "By the time they notice, everything will make sense legally." I didn't move. My heartbeat filled my ears. There was a pause, then her voice again, quieter. "No, they won't fight it. He's too old-fashioned. He thinks kindness is strength." She laughed softly, a sound I'd never heard from her before, sharp and cold. I set the glass down on the counter. The sound was small, but it made her stop talking. I heard the click of her phone being locked. When she stepped out of the kitchen, she saw me standing there. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "No." "Needed water." She smiled faintly, her eyes searching mine. "You should rest. Stress isn't good for you at your age." She walked past me, her perfume lingering in the air, light and expensive. I stood there long after she went upstairs. The house was still, but my mind wasn't. Her words replayed over and over, each one clearer than before. "Everything will make sense legally." I knew that tone. I'd heard it in people who thought they were smarter than everyone else, people who planned before they acted. It wasn't a mistake, it was a strategy. The next morning, I told Maggie what I'd heard. She sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, expression pale. "Maybe you misunderstood," she said quietly. "Ava wouldn't do something like that." "Wouldn't she?" I asked. Maggie didn't answer. She looked down at her hands and whispered, "Please don't start something we can't finish." But something had already started. I could feel it in my bones. Ava wasn't just taking over the house. She was setting something in motion, something that would push us out completely. That evening, Ethan came home late from work. Ava met him at the door, kissed him on the cheek, and handed him a folder. He glanced at me, uncomfortable. She whispered something to him I couldn't hear, and he nodded. They both went upstairs without a word. I sat in the living room alone. The house creaked with the weight of years and secrets. The faint light from the nursery slipped through the hallway. I thought about the words she'd said on the phone and how confident she had sounded. "Everything will make sense legally." That phrase didn't belong to a young mother. It belonged to someone planning ownership, someone thinking ahead. I turned off the lamp and sat there in the dark for a long time. The shadows stretched across the floor like lines I couldn't cross. Finally, I stood up, my legs stiff, and went to the window. Outside, the yard was still, the oak tree unmoving in the humid Texas night. If Ava was doing what I thought she was doing, I needed proof. I needed to know how deep this went before I confronted anyone. I went down the hall quietly, careful not to wake Maggie. She was asleep, her breathing steady. I grabbed a small flashlight from the drawer and made my way down the basement stairs. The air grew cooler with each step. The old filing cabinet was still there, tucked in the corner beneath the shelves of tools and dusty boxes. It had been years since I opened it. The key was on my workbench. I picked it up and felt the cold metal press into my palm. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. And before anyone else noticed, I had to find out why. Chapter 4. Evidence in the Dark. The key turned with a faint click. I pulled open the metal drawer, and the smell of dust and old paper rose up like a ghost from another life. Inside were folders I hadn't touched in years, records from when I built the house, old warranties, receipts from Home Depot, tax forms. My fingers moved slowly through them, careful not to leave a trace that the cabinet had been disturbed. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I'd recognize it when I saw it. Halfway through the stack, something felt off. A folder labeled Utilities that should have been thick with years of bills was half empty. The few that remained weren't in my handwriting. They were printed from online statements, clean and modern, all addressed to Ava Hartwell Callahan. My stomach tightened. I flipped through them one by one. Electric, water, gas, internet. Each one had her name, her email, even her phone number listed as the primary contact. My own information was gone. I set the folder aside and opened another. Mortgage insurance, property taxes, HOA notices, all printed from the last 2 years, all forwarded to her email address. And at the bottom of one envelope, a form slipped free. It was a photocopy, slightly creased at the edges. The words at the top read, Property Authorization Form. The line where my signature should have been made my hand go cold. The scrawl was close, careful, but not mine. It was too smooth, the R too curved. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for my mind to tell me it was some kind of clerical mistake. It didn't. Behind me, the floor creaked. I turned fast, my heart leaping, but it was only the pipes shifting in the walls. I let out a shaky breath, folded the papers, and slid them inside my jacket. I turned off the flashlight and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the silence of the house above me. When I finally went upstairs, Maggie was sitting at the kitchen table, her robe pulled tight around her shoulders. The lamp over the sink cast a weak glow across her face. She looked up, startled. "Robert, where were you?" I hesitated, then walked over and placed the papers on the table. "You need to see this." She reached for them with trembling fingers. The first few pages made her frown, but when she saw the signature, she froze. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Then she whispered, "She's taking our home." I nodded, the words heavy between us. Maggie sat back, covering her mouth. Her eyes glistened with disbelief. I thought about all the times Ava had smiled sweetly, called her mom, acted like she belonged here. It made my skin crawl. "We can't let her see that we know," I said quietly. "Not yet." Maggie looked at me, afraid. "What are you going to do?" "Find out exactly how far this goes." I folded the papers again and slipped them back into my jacket. The sound of footsteps came from the hallway upstairs. Maggie's head jerked toward the sound. It was late. Too late for anyone to be up, except maybe Ava feeding the baby. The footsteps came closer. I quickly turned off the lamp. A soft light spilled from the top of the stairs, then the creak of another step. I could hear her humming faintly, some lullaby, slow and deliberate. Then her shadow stretched across the floor as she appeared at the bottom of the staircase. She stopped when she saw us. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her tone casual, polite, but her eyes scanning the table. Maggie spoke first, her voice too quick. "I was just getting some tea." Ava smiled, a small perfect curve of her lips. "Everything all right, Dad?" I forced myself to meet her eyes. "Everything's fine. Go on back to bed." For a second, she didn't move. Then she nodded. "Don't stay up too late." The baby finally fell asleep. She walked away, her robe brushing against the hardwood. I waited until her footsteps disappeared before I let out the breath I'd been holding. Maggie's hand found mine under the table. Robert, she knows something. Maybe. But so do we. Neither of us spoke after that. The papers on the table seemed to hum in the quiet. I folded them carefully, placed them inside a manila envelope, and tucked it deep inside my jacket pocket. Maggie followed me upstairs, neither of us saying another word. She stopped at the nursery door, listening to the soft sound of Oliver breathing through the baby monitor. The innocence of that small sound made the rest of the night feel even colder. When we reached our room, she turned to me. What if she calls the bank? What if she's already done something? I sat down on the edge of the bed, my thoughts racing. I'll handle it. She wanted to believe me. I could tell, but fear had already found a home in her eyes. I lay awake long after she fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between the creaks in the house. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every small sound made my pulse quicken. Somewhere in the dark, I could hear Ava moving around, maybe checking on the baby, maybe checking something else. By morning, the decision was made. There was no point pretending anymore. The woman I'd let into my home was trying to take it piece by piece, and if I didn't act soon, she'd succeed. When the sun rose, Maggie made coffee, her hand still trembling as she poured it into my cup. She didn't ask what I planned to do. She just said quietly, "Be careful." I kissed her on the forehead and grabbed my jacket from the chair. The papers were still there, folded tightly in the pocket like a heartbeat. Outside, the air was cool, the kind of crisp Texas morning that used to make me feel alive. I walked down the driveway, the weight of 10 years pressing on my shoulders. Ava was in the kitchen window holding Oliver, smiling faintly as if nothing had ever been wrong. She waved. I waved back. Then I got into my truck, started the engine, and drove toward downtown Austin. There was one man I trusted enough to help me figure out what to do next. Before the clock struck 9, I was parked outside Bennett and Co. law offices. Harold Bennett had been my attorney since I first bought the property. He was older now, grayer, but sharper than anyone I knew. As I sat there for a moment, watching people walk by with their coffees and briefcases, I thought about how quickly a life could shift from stability to chaos. I reached into my pocket, felt the edges of the envelope, and took a deep breath. Then I opened the truck door and stepped into the morning, ready to find out how much damage had already been done. Chapter 5. A Web of Deceit. Harold looked up from the papers, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. His office smelled like old books and coffee, the kind of scent that made you believe the man sitting across from you had seen every trick in the book. He flipped through the last page, his jaw tightening as he scanned the forged signature. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "She is building an adverse possession case, Robert. If you don't act, she could claim ownership within a few years." I just stared at him. The words didn't land all at once. They came in slow, heavy waves. Claim ownership. My house, the place where Maggie and I had raised our son, where we'd built every inch with our hands, was now a legal target. I swallowed hard. "Are you telling me she can take it?" "Not yet," Harold said. "But if she keeps paying bills in her name and shows continued control over the property, she can make a claim that you've relinquished it. It won't happen overnight, but if you stay quiet, the law might start believing her story instead of yours." I rubbed my temples. "How is this even possible?" He sighed, taking off his glasses. "Because the law favors the one who acts like the owner. Paperwork, payments, appearances. She's playing the long game." I leaned back, the leather chair creaking under me. It felt like the air in the room had been sucked out. Maggie and I had spent decades trying to help Ethan, trying to keep our family together, and now his wife was turning our kindness into a weapon. Harold studied me for a moment. "You're not the first to deal with something like this. Greed makes people clever. The good news is, you found out early enough to stop her. What do I do?" "You need proof. More than just documents, photos, witnesses, anything that shows she's been misrepresenting herself. Does anyone in your neighborhood know what's been going on? Henry Blake next door. He's retired law enforcement. Harold nodded. Talk to him. See if he's noticed anything. And Robert, keep this quiet. If she catches wind of what you're doing, she'll cover her tracks. I stood, still gripping the envelope. Harold placed a hand on my arm before I left. You've been generous, Robert. Too generous. Sometimes the hardest part of doing the right thing is realizing it might break the people you love. His words stayed with me the whole drive home. The city outside blurred past, but my thoughts were clear. Ava wasn't just manipulating the house. She was manipulating all of us. When I pulled into the driveway, the garage door was open. Ethan's car was gone, but Ava's SUV sat crooked in its space. I stepped out of the truck, my pulse steady. My anger cooled into something sharper. Inside, Maggie was sitting at the kitchen table, folding laundry. She looked up. Did he say anything? Plenty. We have a fight ahead of us. Before she could answer, the front door opened. Ethan walked in, his face pale. He didn't even notice us at first. He went straight to the counter, dropped his keys, and ran his hand through his hair. You all right? I asked. He looked up, eyes red. They fired me. Maggie gasped. Fired you? Why? He sank into the chair opposite her. Someone used my name for a loan, $45,000. The company said it looked suspicious. They traced the paperwork to me, but I swear I never signed anything. The room went still. I didn't have to look at Maggie to know what we were both thinking. Ethan, I said carefully. Are you sure you didn't authorize it? Dad. Come on. Of course not. I've never even applied for a loan that big. Does Ava know? His jaw clenched. I haven't told her yet. Maggie tried to sound calm. Maybe there's been a mistake. He shook his head. There's no mistake. Laura from work called me this morning. She said the loan was tied to a business application under my name, an event planning company. Maggie blinked. Event planning? Yeah, and guess who runs one out of this house? The silence between us was louder than any shout. Ethan stared at the table, breathing hard. I wanted to be wrong. God, I wanted it to be something else, anything else. But it wasn't. Ava had gone further than I imagined. Ethan stood abruptly. I'm going to talk to her. Wait, I said, standing too. Don't go in angry. He stopped at the doorway. Angry is all I've got left. He walked outside before I could stop him. Maggie pressed her hands to her face. What if she turns this on him? She whispered. Then it's time he saw her for who she really is. I waited at the window, watching the driveway. 10 minutes passed before I saw them through the kitchen blinds. Ava was on the porch, arms crossed, expression cold. Ethan stood across from her, waving the papers Laura must have sent. I couldn't hear them, but I didn't need to. I could read the tension in their bodies. Ava's face hardened. Then her voice rose, sharp and cutting. She pointed toward the house, her gestures growing wild. Ethan stepped back, shaking his head. Then he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. She stood there a moment longer before she went inside, slamming the door. When Ethan came back in, he looked hollow. She said she did it for us, he said, for our future. She thought she could double the money. He sank into the couch, running both hands through his hair. Maggie sat beside him and touched his arm, but he didn't respond. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, I stepped outside for air. The porch light flickered. Henry Blake's light was still on next door. I walked over. He met me at the door with a knowing look. Everything all right, Robert? Not really. I think Ava's been up to something with the property. I didn't want to say too much, but I could see the understanding in his eyes. You might want to check your cameras, he said. I saw someone bring a man here last week, real estate type, clipboard, papers. When? Tuesday, maybe Wednesday, around noon. My stomach sank. Ava had said she was running errands that day. Henry scratched his chin. I can check the footage if you want. Please do. He nodded. I'll pull it tomorrow. I thanked him and walked back home. The house loomed in the dark, big and empty despite the people inside. I stood at the door, staring through the window at the soft glow of the living room lamp. Ava was there, rocking Oliver in her arms. From this distance, she looked peaceful, even gentle, but I knew better now. Inside, Maggie was waiting. Did you find anything? Maybe. Henry saw something. She didn't ask what. She just reached for my hand. Be careful, she whispered. I squeezed her hand, my voice steady but low. I don't want to destroy my family, Maggie, but I won't let them destroy me. That night, while the rest of the house slept, I sat in my study, writing down everything, dates, names, words she'd said, every detail I could remember. It was time to start keeping records of my own. Chapter 6, The Sun's Awakening. The next morning, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Maggie moved quietly around the kitchen, trying to keep things normal, but her hands shook as she poured coffee. Ethan hadn't said much since the night before. He left early, saying he needed air. Ava was upstairs with the baby, humming softly like nothing in the world was wrong. The sound of her voice, calm and sweet, made my skin crawl. By mid-afternoon, Ethan still hadn't come home. I tried to focus on some repair work in the garage, but every time I heard a car in the distance, I hoped it was him. When the door finally opened, he stepped inside, with a look I hadn't seen since he was a kid caught doing something wrong. Only this time, it was something much bigger. Dad, he said quietly, can we talk? I wiped my hands and nodded toward the kitchen. Maggie looked up, saw his face, and didn't ask a thing. She just set another cup of coffee on the table and left us alone. Ethan sat down, shoulders tense. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. I found this. Where? On Ava's laptop. She left it open this morning while she was feeding Oliver. I wasn't snooping, not at first. She got an email notification. It said, Property Valuation Report. I clicked it, and he stopped, staring at the flash drive in his hand. And what? It's our house, Dad. It was sent to a realtor named Trent Wallace. There are appraisal photos, floor plans, even a note about potential buyers. The file lists her as the primary contact. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. It was one thing to suspect she was scheming. It was another to hear she'd already started selling the dream. Ethan's voice cracked. There's more. I found a folder called Documents. It's full of fake financial forms, loan approvals, ID copies, and a letter of authorization with your name on it. She's been building this for months. He slid the flash drive across the table. I stared at it, the small piece of plastic that held the truth. You sure it was her? He nodded. Her signature, her email, everything. My chest felt heavy, the weight of betrayal pressing down harder than anger ever could. I looked at my son and saw the guilt written all over his face. I should have known, he said. I should have stopped her. This isn't your fault, I told him. She's good at making people believe her lies. She made us both believe. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. I confronted her before I came here. I waited. She didn't deny it. She just started yelling, saying she did it for us, for our future, that I'd never understand what it's like to worry about money every second. Then she started crying. I almost believed her, for half a second, but when I asked if she forged your signature, she didn't answer. She just grabbed her purse and stormed out. Where did she go? She said she had to meet Trent to finalize the appraisal. I don't even know who that is. I did. Henry had mentioned a man with papers and a clipboard. Ethan dropped his head into his hands. I think I just watched my marriage fall apart. I put a hand on his shoulder. Better that than watching her steal your family's life. He gave a broken laugh, the kind that comes when you're too tired to cry. Later that afternoon, Henry knocked on my door. He was holding a small USB stick. Got something you'll want to see, he said. I invited him in, and he set up the footage on my laptop. The grainy image showed the front yard from his security camera. The timestamp read 1:14 p.m. Ava appeared first, her hair tied back neatly, a folder in her hand. A man in a pressed shirt and dark slacks followed her up the walkway. Trent Wallace, she said, as she shook his hand. They stopped by the front door. I couldn't hear them, but Henry had added subtitles from the camera's audio. Ava smiled and gestured toward the house, saying she was the property manager. Then she pulled out a badge, the kind used by county inspectors. It looked real enough on the blurry video. Trent nodded, taking notes as she led him inside. My heart pounded as the camera switched angles, catching them through the living room window. She pointed to the walls, the ceiling, the staircase, speaking with the ease of someone who believed she owned it. Henry folded his arms. She told him she was acting on behalf of the owner, that you were considering transferring the deed for tax reasons. The guy didn't question it. Maggie gasped quietly behind me. She had been standing in the doorway, hand over her mouth. Henry continued. I can pull a copy of the footage onto a drive for you. It's all there? Thank you, Henry. You have no idea what this means. He gave a small nod. I'm sorry, Robert. I liked her once. She fooled all of us. When he left, I sat at the table with Maggie and Ethan, the footage looping silently on the screen. Each frame was another cut. Ava, smiling, gesturing, confident. The house behind her, glowing in the afternoon light. My house. Ethan's voice was quiet. She lied about everything. I looked at him. Son, people like her don't see lies. They see plans. He stared at the footage, then stood abruptly. I need to clear my head. He went out to the porch, and I could see the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. Maggie turned to me. What now? Now we fight back. That night, after Maggie went to bed, I drove to the corner gas station, bought a cheap notebook, and started writing again. Not just memories this time, evidence, dates, conversations, witnesses, copies of documents. Every move she made had to be recorded. Around 10, Ethan came back inside. He looked calmer, but his eyes were distant. He sat across from me at the table. Dad, do you think she's capable of something worse? I looked at the man my son had become, the man torn between love and truth, and said the only honest thing I could. I think she's capable of anything that gives her control. He nodded slowly, as if he'd known that all along, but hadn't wanted to believe it. Then he pushed the flash drive toward me. I can't keep this in the house. I took it, slid it into the same envelope as the property papers. We'll take this to Harold in the morning. Ethan hesitated. What if she finds out? She already knows we're not blind anymore, I said. That's enough to scare her. We sat there in silence, father and son, the quiet broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator. For years I had carried the burden of trying to protect him from pain. Now we were carrying it together. When I finally stood, the clock read midnight. I placed the envelope inside my jacket, the weight of it heavy but certain. Tomorrow, I would walk into Harold's office with proof no one could argue. The damage was done, but the fight was just beginning. Chapter 7. The Courtroom and the Gavel of Justice. The courthouse smelled like paper and disinfectant, the kind of scent that clings to old hallways and nervous hearts. Maggie sat beside me, hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. Ethan was across the aisle, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Harold Bennett leaned toward me, whispering a few last-minute reminders, but my mind was already far from his words. I had been waiting for this day for months, though nothing about it felt like victory. When the bailiff called the room to order, every sound seemed amplified: the shuffle of chairs, the murmur of lawyers, the heavy click of the door closing behind us. Judge Naomi Harris entered, calm and composed, her black robe flowing like a quiet warning. I had seen that kind of stillness before, the kind that comes from years of watching truth and lies unravel in front of you. Ava sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, Emily Grant. She looked immaculate, as always. Her hair was perfectly pinned, her suit pressed, her face soft with carefully painted grief. When her eyes met mine, she smiled faintly, as if this were just another negotiation she was certain she would win. Judge Harris glanced at the file before her. Mrs. Hartwell Callahan, you're alleging emotional abuse and manipulation against the defendants Robert and Margaret Callahan. You're also contesting the ownership of the property at 2112 Hilltop Drive. Is that correct? Emily Grant stood, her voice smooth and practiced. Yes, Your Honor. My client has suffered years of mistreatment at the hands of her in-laws. She has evidence showing repeated verbal abuse and isolation. We also intend to prove that the transfer of the property was agreed upon verbally, prior to their recent attempts to disinherit her. The words landed like small stabs. Maggie tensed beside me. I could feel her fingers tremble against my arm. Harold stood calmly. Your Honor, we will show that no such agreement existed, and that my client, Robert Callahan, has been the victim of forgery and fraud. The evidence will speak for itself. Emily called Ava to the stand first. She walked up gracefully, taking her oath with practiced poise. Then the performance began. She spoke about moving in with us, about how difficult those early years were, how we allegedly belittled her and made her feel unwelcome. She described Maggie as controlling, me as cold and dismissive. Her voice trembled in all the right places. When she cried, it was quiet, delicate, rehearsed. At one point, Emily played an audio clip on a small speaker. Maggie's voice filled the room, sharp and brittle. It sounded like her saying, "You're not part of this family, Ava. We never wanted you here." Maggie's face went white. I reached for her hand, but she pulled it back, frozen. Harold rose slowly. Permission to cross-examine, Your Honor. Judge Harris nodded. Mrs. Hartwell Callahan, who recorded that audio? Ava blinked, tears still glistening. I did. I was scared of what she might do to me. Harold tilted his head slightly. And did you edit it? Her eyes flickered for a fraction of a second. No. He walked to the evidence table, pressing a few keys on his laptop. Then he turned the screen toward the court. I'd like to submit Exhibit D. This is video footage captured by neighbor Henry Blake's home security camera on the same day as the alleged recording. The screen lit up with black and white footage of our living room window. Through the glass, Ava stood near the table, holding her phone, practicing her lines out loud before recording. The timestamp matched the audio file she'd submitted. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Ava's face drained of color. Harold didn't stop. We'll also present documentation proving the defendant's signature on the property authorization form was forged. The handwriting analysis report will confirm it was executed by the plaintiff. He handed the judge a thick file. Judge Harris flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowing slightly. Emily tried to interrupt. Your Honor, that's circumstantial. Judge Harris held up a hand. I've read enough for now. Let's proceed. Harold turned to me. Mr. Callahan, please take the stand. I walked up slowly, feeling the weight of every year pressing on my back. The oath felt strange on my tongue, a promise I had already kept for most of my life. Harold kept his questions simple. I explained how Maggie and I had invited them to stay, how the bills began changing names, how we discovered the forgery, and finally, how Henry's footage confirmed Ava's deception. When I stepped down, Ethan rose from his seat. He didn't wait to be called. His voice carried across the courtroom before the clerk even finished swearing him in. I'm Ethan Callahan, he said, his voice rough but steady. I was her husband. He looked directly at Ava, who refused to meet his eyes. She told me she forged the papers to protect our future. She said it was for our family, but it wasn't. It was for money, for control. Everything she did, every lie, was about owning something that was never hers. Ava shifted in her chair, her mask cracking just a little. Ethan's hand trembled slightly on the rail. I let it happen. I ignored the signs. But my parents didn't deserve this. None of us did. Judge Harris nodded. Thank you, Mr. Callahan. When he sat down, I saw the faintest trace of peace in his face, the kind that comes only after speaking a truth that's been eating at you for years. Emily tried one last time to twist the story, suggesting that Maggie and I had manipulated Ethan against his wife, but Harold stood calmly, hands folded, and said nothing. He didn't need to. The evidence had already buried her. When the judge spoke again, her tone was firm but measured. I've heard enough. She looked at Ava, then at me, then at the papers spread before her. This property belongs to Robert and Margaret Callahan. The court finds sufficient evidence of forgery and fraud committed by the plaintiff, Ava Hartwell Callahan. Restitution will be determined at a later date. Her gavel struck the block with a sharp crack. Ava's composure shattered instantly. She covered her face, sobbing into her hands. For a moment, I felt nothing but emptiness. No joy, no anger. Just quiet. Maggie sat beside me, tears rolling down her cheeks, but her shoulders relaxed for the first time in years. When the courtroom emptied, Ava remained seated, her lawyer whispering useless comfort. As Maggie and I stood to leave, Ava looked up, her mascara streaked, her voice barely a whisper. Please, can I see my son? Maggie turned to her, her voice steady, soft but unyielding. That's for the court to decide. We walked out into the Texas sunlight, the air heavy and warm. I could feel the weight of the past lifting, but only slightly. Justice had come, but it hadn't healed the wound. It never really does. Chapter 8. Karma and Peace. A full year passed before the house finally felt like itself again. The silence that used to feel heavy had turned soft, like a kind of peace settling over the walls. The echoes of arguments, slammed doors, and whispered fears were gone. What was left was the steady rhythm of life, returning to something simple and good. Ava's sentence had been light compared to the damage she caused, but justice had its way. She served probation and community service at a local food bank. The divorce went through quietly. Ethan was granted full custody of Oliver, and that alone seemed to bring him back to life. He started working again for a small construction firm on the edge of town. The long days, the honest work, they grounded him. He came home tired but steady, the kind of tired that brings peace instead of pain. Maggie spent most mornings in her garden, the one she'd neglected for years. She planted tulips and roses, kneeling in the dirt like she used to when Ethan was a boy. Sometimes Oliver would toddle after her, carrying a small plastic watering can, splashing more water on himself than the flowers. She would laugh, a real laugh, the kind that had been missing for too long. As for me, I fixed things, the porch railings, the loose shutters, the broken gate, things I could control with my hands. There was comfort in rebuilding, in putting the pieces back together, one nail at a time. On warm afternoons, I'd sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sunlight spill across the yard where Oliver chased butterflies. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It was home again. Ethan came by most evenings after work. He'd sit with me and tell stories about his new projects, about the crew that respected him, about the life he was slowly reclaiming. Sometimes he'd stop mid-sentence to watch Oliver run toward Maggie, and I could see the quiet pride in his face. He was learning what it meant to protect peace, not just chase it. One night, long after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The old clock ticked softly on the wall, steady as ever. On the mantel, the family photo from years ago still stood, the same one Ava once tried to move out of sight. It had been cleaned, reframed, and put back in its rightful place. I looked at it for a long time. The faces, the smiles, the life we once had before greed took root. Somewhere between the stillness and the ticking clock, I thought of Ava. Word had reached me through a friend in town. She had remarried to Trent Wallace, the same man who had helped her forge the appraisal reports. They had moved to Dallas, started a new life, or so she'd said online. But a few months later, Trent disappeared. No note, no goodbye. He took everything she had left, the money, the savings, the little pieces of comfort she'd built from someone else's pain. When I heard that, I didn't feel satisfaction, not even relief, just a strange, quiet ache. Life had a way of balancing itself, and she'd learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Maggie found me still sitting by the fire that night. She put a hand on my shoulder, gentle and warm. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" I nodded. "I don't hate her. I just wish she'd learned what home really means." Maggie smiled faintly, her eyes kind. "Maybe she will someday." She went upstairs, and I stayed there a while longer, listening to the soft hum of the house, the creaks in the floor, the faint rustle of the wind outside, even the gentle breathing of the people I loved sleeping under this roof. All of it felt alive again, like the house itself was healing along with us. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the yard. The moonlight caught the edges of the garden, where Maggie's flowers swayed. Oliver's little toy truck lay forgotten in the grass. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel anger or fear or the weight of the past. I just felt gratitude. A house isn't just walls and roof. It's the boundary of trust. It's built from the small, quiet acts of showing up every day, of forgiving, of choosing love over pride. I learned that the hard way, and I learned that when someone tries to steal your kindness, you don't stop being kind. You just stop giving it to the wrong people. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I thought about all the people who'd been through something like this, who'd opened their homes and hearts only to be betrayed. I wished I could tell them what I'd learned standing in that courtroom, what I'd felt rebuilding this house piece by piece. That strength doesn't always look like fighting back. Sometimes it's just standing firm, refusing to let someone else define who you are. If you've ever had to stand up for yourself after years of silence, if you've ever rebuilt your peace from the ashes of someone else's greed, then you already know this story. You know what it means to lose everything except your integrity, and how that turns out to be enough. And if you're still in the middle of it, wondering when the storm will end, remember this: the truth has its own clock. It may run slow, but it never stops ticking, and when it catches up, it always finds its way home.